Good evening and welcome. My name is Robert Dijkgraaf, Director Leon Levy, Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this public lecture by Jonathan Israel on the happy occasion of our semi-annual board meeting. We see the title, Contesting American Values, the Bumpy Rise of Democracy. Jonathan and I were just saying that just following the daily news is so bumpy that I don't dare to do it. We're getting motion sick almost, but so it's good to take a little bit more of a historical perspective. And the other day I mentioned also that there's this famous quote, I think from Chu Enlai, who's apparently asked, what he thought of the French Revolution, and he apparently said it's too soon to tell. But if you actually check, do a little bit of research, probably the idea was that he was referring to the Paris Revolution of 1968 instead of 1789. So again, it's an example of a great anecdote destroyed by historical research, and I hope we'll see many more. As you know, of course, Jonathan being here for a long time, but he's now in a new status. He's now Professor Emeritus in the School of Historical Studies, which means that his schedule is even fuller, and he's even more actively of course, I have a kind of a special relation to your work because I've said on other occasions that Jonathan is something of a national hero in the Netherlands, being seen as really the most distinguished historian of Dutch history, particularly of the 17th century. And of course, I hope to bump into him here at the Institute, but on other occasions we meet in hotels in Amsterdam. The last occasion was when you were actually speaking on a symposium that was discussing whether Spinoza's ban should be lifted. A very interesting topic for a lecture here too. As you know, Jonathan has, his research has been focusing on the Enlightenment, in particular what he's called the radical Enlightenment, which is a very deep, arguing for a deep history of the Enlightenment movement. Certainly, where Spinoza plays a very important role, the 17th century developments, in some sense describing the intellectual roots. And he's done that in a series of very impressive books that got worldwide attention. And I think we here at the Institute are particularly proud that you were able to compose such an oeuvre, and I think the special circumstances here have been beneficial to it. His latest work was Revolutionary Ideas, an intellectual history of the French Revolution from the right of man to Robespierre, and he was awarded the 2015 Prose Award in European and World History for that book. And I think his lecture today will be also expanding on a recently completed book, The Expanding Blaze, The Global Impact of the American Revolution, which is forthcoming in 2017 with Princeton University Press. Now, many honors and awards I can sum here. You're a member both of the British Academy and the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Jonathan obtained his doctorate from the University of Oxford. He had a long career at University College London, was a professor there till the year 2000 when he joined the faculty of the Institute. Among the many honors, I'll mention the Heineken Prize in History, his knighthood in the Order of the Dutch Lion, and the Leon Gershon Award that he was awarded in 2001. So in today's lecture, Jonathan will discuss how modern representative democracy, as we know, managed to survive, which is a very hopeful view into the immediate future, and I hope that we can all embrace that future. Thank you very much for giving this lecture, John.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Robert, for that very kind introduction. Of course, just a few days before the presidential election, we're all in a state of at least mild political excitement. So I thought that a suitable topic would in fact be, since the political debate, most of us would agree, has not been especially edifying up to now, I thought it would be appropriate to go back to when the debate about American values was really a great drama and an amazing and furious conflict, as I hope to convince you was actually the case. Now, I like this particular print, though it's a scene taking place in England, in Manchester in 1819, a field just outside Manchester, actually, precisely because it does convey the extraordinarily furious sense of pandemonium let loose by the principle of democracy in the not just in Britain, but in America, but in the Western world generally. There's a woman on the podium, women's rights are already part of it. The man with the red banner on the left, it says, I know you can't read the slogans very well, it says universal suffrage. The idea of universal suffrage provoked such tremendous conflict, and I think that I want to try to explain why. Many people, of course, resented the old system, which left the vast majority of people out of any kind of representation or participation in government. But the stranger part of this for us is why so many people joined the campaign to stop democracy, and why there was such a massive effort to present democracy as something absolutely destructive of basic values and destructive of society itself. So I want to try to convey a sense of the newness, the divisiveness, and the tremendous force of the transformation of political culture that affected the entire North Atlantic world from the American Revolution down to the middle of the 19th century. Usually, we think of early America as being a rather separate story from France in the Age of Revolutions and Britain at this time, and the different national historiographies tend to reinforce this impression and set these stories sharply apart. But actually, if you focus on the main themes and principles involved, why it was so new, why it was so divisive, and why the principle of democracy was so widely opposed as well as supported, I think the picture is really one of striking and remarkably close parallelisms. And that's the theme that I'd like to bring out, if I'm able to, in the lecture this evening. So the period from the beginning of the American Revolution in the mid-1770s down to 1848 is so important in the formation of what you might call Western modernity, that it's pretty well can be described as the crucible of Western modernity. People standing at the back, there are lots of seats down here in the front. But before I go on, I think one very crucial and fundamental fact has to be borne in mind. And that is that all Western societies at this time were either absolutist monarchies, where the populace had no representation at all, or they were what you might call aristocratic republics, republics which were run, even if, as in the case of a constitutional monarchy like Britain, the monarchy still had a certain influence in the processes of government, Britain was basically an aristocratic republic. As Poland was too, and other countries. Or there were some actual aristocratic republics like Venice, the Swiss cantons, or the Dutch Republic, but that's all you had. You either had absolute monarchies or you had aristocratic republics. There was no such thing as a representative democracy in the Western world when the American Revolution broke out in the mid-1770s. But the idea of democracy and a pressure for democracy was already an important tendency in the American Revolution, very clearly so by 1776, and is of course implied by the principles of equality which were announced with such force in the Declaration of Independence, written by Jefferson. So the fact that democracy was on the scene and was already provoking both support and opposition means that the American Revolution was, in fact, a four-way stretch. Now, of course, one basic division in American society in the 1770s is very well known to everybody, and it's neatly represented on this slide. So quite a large slice of American society said, no, rebellion against the crown, against against Parliament. No, you can't do that. So the Loyalists, or the Tories as they were called then, some estimates put them at around 18 or 20%, those that were of the American population, those that were willing to express in one form or another their support for Parliament and the Crown. those loyalists who absolutely were resistant to the revolution and refused to accept it and left the country were actually very numerous. We know that about 70,000 Americans altogether, that's 4 to 5% of the total US population in 1775, fled the country, mostly going to, the largest slice went to Canada, which I want to mention several times in the lecture because Canada is an interesting example of the evolving conflict between aristocratism, as I should call it, or aristocratic republics and democracy. And of course the Loyalists, the Tories in Canada, did a lot to reinforce this tendency. Other Loyalists went either back to Britain itself, or Ireland sometimes, or to the Caribbean. Actually, the number of exiles that left France during the French Revolution was around 350,000, which is something like 5 times as many as the number of emigres from the United States during the American Revolution. But the population of France in 1780 was 10 times as big as that of the United States. So the American Revolution, you could say by this measure, was twice as disruptive as the French Revolution. That's not usually how Americans think about the American Revolution, but of course it was socially transformative and tremendously disruptive, just as the French Revolution was as well. And you could easily argue that it was more disruptive because in proportion, that's 70,000 emigres from the United States who left their property behind, their lands were seized in many cases and transferred to other families, represents an even larger disruption. This split in American society is well known, and probably everybody here knows something about the Tories and the Loyalists. But what's much less well understood is the split between Democrats and anti-Democrats, and that is the central theme of the lecture this evening. Now, of the 13 states, there are actually 14 states, because although Vermont didn't join the United States yet, Vermont was also part of the revolution and also became independent in 1776. It just stayed on its own for a while to the 1790s. Vermont's important because it was the only other state, apart from Pennsylvania, that adopted universal male suffrage. So you could say that the democratic tendency, which was very noticeable in certain places, especially Philadelphia, where there was a strong caucus who actually, through a coup, seized control of the Pennsylvania state legislature early in 1776. So there's a kind of mini revolution within the revolution in Pennsylvania, which is extremely important because that is the beginning of Western democracy, really. And Tom Paine played the famous publicist, democratic publicist, and publicist for the American Revolution, played a large part in this mini revolution in Philadelphia. Now, what we see in this extremely complicated print, and I'm sorry that you can't read the slogans. The more important slogans I'll briefly mention. Now, so between 1776 and 1790, the Pennsylvania State Constitution was the main example of a democratic, representative democratic constitution in the Western world. But it was immediately under siege, with lots of support, especially from the clergy, from religious groups, and economic and financial vested interests. And that's neatly represented on this complicated print. So the besieged fortress here, this is democracy, Pennsylvania's new democracy in 1776. That banner says Franklin and Liberty. Around it, you've got a whole variety of special interest groups which are besieging this democratic constitution. And just to mention one or two of the most important banners, I don't know why he's only got one leg, but this rather well-dressed gentleman who's leading one group up the wall there is yelling, follow me up, boys, I will be governor. This constitution is too democratic. The people are never virtuous enough to enjoy so much liberty. We are the gentleman's party. I will keep down those plebeians. So this is what the American Revolution is about as well. And here we have the bankers' corps there, they're being helped by the devil. The devil appears in a lot of the propaganda prints of the revolutionary period. They've got a massive chain which I suppose symbolizes the element of despotism that they're going to bring into the picture if they succeed. The banners up there contain various insults against Tom Paine is described as Tom Fool, and his Common Sense, his most famous pamphlet of the Revolution, as Uncommon Sense, and so on. Now, Franklin and Tom Paine were certainly the two best-known representatives of the democratic tendency in 1776. And as many people here will know, Tom Paine's pamphlet Common Sense was the most widely read and the most sensational pamphlet of the entire American Revolution. It was very well known. The number of copies, it was reprinted many, many times. The number of copies distributed was quite sensational in itself. And, but the important point is not only that Tom Paine's pamphlet Common Sense played a large part in tipping the balance towards going for all-out independence, for total rebellion against British rule. It certainly played a part in that respect. But what many, John Adams for instance, but many other leading patriots who were founding fathers, prominent in the revolution, that was okay, they had no objection to that. But what they found rather disgusting and took very great exception to in Common Sense was the democratic tone, the attack on the gentry and on the British aristocracy. It wasn't just an attack on the British Parliament and Crown, but on the whole British Empire, in fact on the British parliamentary model of restricted suffrage, governance by aristocracy, which is quite firmly and obviously rejected. That they found unacceptable. And already in Common Sense, you could see, if you look at Adams' letters, for instance, about it, you can see there's big trouble coming. That's not what the American Revolution is about. We're not aiming to create a democracy. And already there was tremendous tension in the situation. Well, there's Tom Paine, and there's the title page of his Common Sense. One thing the vast success of Paine's pamphlet reflected, I think, and in the background, this must be one of the main reasons why it's in this period that democracy becomes a possibility and begins to generate so much tension in the Western Atlantic world, is precisely the very large number of people who were able to read it, or at least read it to others in groups. And I think among the most important reasons for the late 18th century being different from the early modern period down to, say, about 1750, is that literacy was certainly growing a lot. And especially since the Reformation, of course the Reformation encouraged literacy, certain countries, particularly Calvinistic ones like the Netherlands, the literacy rate was high enough by the late 17th century for us to be able to say that most men could read. And although there were a lot of people who couldn't read, the proportion who were literate in the United States by 1775 was very high. Very few societies had had so many literate people before, and I think this is one of the most crucial reasons. You could say the same about France. We can see that literacy levels, especially for men, but for women too, were rising steadily through the 17th and 18th century, and I think one of the reasons that the democratic tendency could become a powerful force in France as well in the late 18th century was precisely because now such a substantial proportion of society were able to read these pamphlets and discuss them. Now, already in 1776 then, Tom Paine symbolized the threat to the American system just as much as he did to the British system, and that's something I want to emphasize. Although already a fully committed Democrat in 1776, he hadn't yet quite got to the point of proclaiming universal and equal rights. He does this later during the French Revolution, and proclaiming democracy as the best recipe for all societies, universally, of course including Britain and France as well as America. But Paine's point is the democratic republic is the best form of society. The basic principles of the American Revolution are exactly the same as the basic principles of the French Revolution. This was always Paine's, he's quite right about that, but he perhaps underestimated some of the opposition to this in France. In fact, the Robespierre regime threw him in prison later because they're absolutely not going to accept this sort of thing. But that's another story. I don't want to go into that. But the democratic tendency was, of course, very strong in the French Revolution. And it was considered a terrible threat in America, in France, and in Britain. Now, this print is called Tom Paine and the Corset. In 1792, Paine who had gone back from America to Britain and spent several years in Britain and was agitating for democracy there. But in 1792, Paine was forced to flee Britain and was tried for treason in absentia. And he was never actually able to return to the country. And his book, The Rights of Man, was more or less banned. Not just in the 1790s or at the beginning of the 19th century, but all the way down to the 1820s till about 1832. If you tried to reprint it in Britain, you would be prosecuted. The idea that there wasn't political censorship in England is so vastly incorrect, but I won't go into that. However, Tom Paine remained just as well known in England as he was in America and France, and he continued as a kind of supreme bogeyman in the minds of the British public. And what we see here, he's represented as a corset maker wearing a French revolutionary liberty cap, squeezing the life out of this fine lady who represents the worthy British Constitution by pushing the abstract principles of equality and democracy as hard as he can. Hence the caption underneath reads, "A good constitution sacrificed for a fantastic form." Now we come to the part that's most complicated and perhaps hardest for an audience today to fully grasp. Why? Because we don't think of democracy and religion being in collision, and so it's hard for us to understand why always, without any exception at all, always the furious drama and conflict over democracy is always closely tied up with the issue of religion. And that's something we don't necessarily easily understand today. Everyone can easily understand that aristocrats, American aristocrats or European aristocrats, had no wish to share their privileges and power or let government serve the people rather than vested interests. But why, modern readers ask in some bafflement, was the assault on kings and on aristocracy so closely tied up with with the attack on religious authority? Well, this is because in early modern times, the great churches, those that were recognized by governments, entirely denied that the human individual possesses any sort of religious autonomy, that you were entitled to make up your own mind about religion and defy ecclesiastical authority if your opinions were different. The idea was that all of society must be guided in matters of belief and morality by whatever was the locally established theology. And however, just as the Reformation had earlier begun the process of undermining general illiteracy, which I mentioned as one of the underlying factors that made this great drama possible. The other great barrier to democracy, the huge weight of ecclesiastical authority, which, remember, played a very large part in politics. The clergy were represented in most of the assemblies, the French Estates General, in the British Parliament, and so on. And the same in other countries, in education, in law, in the notions of what morality is and what is moral and what is immoral. Everything was under the guidance of ecclesiastical authority. And therefore, since democracy really depends on the idea of individual autonomy, of making up one's own mind, weighing up the different arguments, being allowed and free to express one's views, to criticize government, and therefore to criticize legislation and laws of whatever kind, not to disobey the law, but to express one's opinion about the law and to make up one's mind about the validity of laws and criticize them where that seemed justified. This is completely incompatible with ecclesiastical authority as it was structured in early modern times. And people tended to confuse religious authority with religion. They thought that you can be a religious person in your own mind and follow let's say, the dictates of Jesus Christ. You can believe in them without necessarily having a lot of respect for the clergy or following what the clergy tell you to do. But at that time, that was not the case. And so you see, as the conservative majority in society, and it was only a minority who were urging democracy and pressing for it, the conservative majority felt genuinely, I mean, it wasn't a pretext, but they like to represent as Robert mentioned just now, what I tend to call the radical enlightenment. But my definition of radical enlightenment is the linkage of democratic republicanism with rejecting the principle of religious authority as the guiding force in society. So where you have this, wherever you have, and it begins in the 17th century, but it really develops and becomes a major force in the 18th century, where you have democratic republicanism tied to rejection of religious authority, that's radical enlightenment. And that's the most important thing that's happened in history, although it doesn't get written about very much. Anyway, to come back to this scene, you see it, when you look at it in detail, it's a very interesting illustration of these themes, which I'm describing. So the clash between democracy and religion produced this tremendous friction, and the slogans here are exactly intended to blacken the reputation and the image of democracy by closely associating it with irreligion and attacks on religion. So, for instance, the slogans there that says no Christianity, no religion, no king, no lords, no commons, and then underneath it's got universal suffrage, as if that's a logical equation to make. Of course, Tom Paine comes into so many of these, and here he is again, The Age of Reason. That was the title of his next book after The Rights of Man, and that was his most deistic work, and the one which made it clearest that Paine wasn't really a Christian in any real sense, and it gave an opportunity to the anti-democrats to closely tie Tom Paine, democracy, and irreligion together. So here they say, The Age of Reason, all the world turned topsy-turvy, exemplified in Tom Paine's works. And you see, of course, general mayhem, cathedrals being overthrown and burnt out. In this corner, you've got Confucianists, Africans, Muslims, and Jews all clapping and laughing at the overthrow of the Christian religion. Well, that's the way political propaganda worked at that time. Now, this print is called the Friends of the People, and here, of course, Franklin and Paine were two great publicists. Another great democratic publicist was a famous scientist, Joseph Priestley, and the devil features again, of course, is encouraging them with their violent schemes. Paine is sitting on barrels of gunpowder. The result of their democratic conspiracy is going to be general mayhem and destruction. And they've got all these murderous weapons lying around, but also some of Joseph Priestley's treatises on chemistry are sort of mixed up with all these murderous weapons and barrels of gunpowder. This one is by Isaac Cruikshank, and it's representing Priestley, like Tom Paine, was very much an international figure. He was not as irreligious as Paine was, and that's a point I want to make, that this radical enlightenment could certainly include persons like Joseph Priestley that we would call religious. I mean, Priestley was a Unitarian Christian. Paine was not a Christian. Priestley was a Christian, but he was a special kind of Christian who didn't accept most theology as it was generally taught at that time. And in particular, he completely rejected the idea that that professional clergies, or that ecclesiastical authority should be institutionalized, should be functionally involved in the processes of legislation, of government, of administration, of education. He said, no, the church doesn't belong there. Take it out of all of our institutions. So because Priestley was a Christian but a great enemy of ecclesiastical authority and of theology as structured in early modern times, therefore, he could be lumped together with the Tom Paines as part of this. And he was a great Democrat, but he became very much an enemy not just of the British Crown and the British aristocracy, but of most people in England. And this is all part of the drama. In fact, he became so unpopular in Birmingham, where he lived, that there were riots against him. And if some friends hadn't got him out of his house in time, he would have, this is 1792, I think, his house was, his laboratory, which for years he'd built up. He was probably the most important scientist in Britain at that time. His laboratory was smashed to smithereens. His house was wrecked. He would have been killed. His friends hadn't got him out a few minutes before. And it became impossible for him to remain in England. So Priestley emigrated in 1794. He went to Pennsylvania, which represented democracy in this early stages of the drama that I'm describing. So that is why, just coming back for a moment to the Peterloo Massacre. It's called the Peterloo Massacre because 15 people were killed in this melee and about 400 were injured. It really was a tremendous to-do. And not only do you have the banner universal suffrage, but here you see you have universal civil and religious liberty. What democracy meant was the autonomy of the individual in every sense, including freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and freedom to choose, complete autonomy in religious matters, something that was very difficult for early modern society to accept. And this autonomy in matters of religion was inherently, integrally linked to the push for democracy, which is what made the whole thing such a tremendous drama and such a huge struggle, and which is the reason why so much of the population in Holland, in England, in France, and in America, and in Canada, which I'll say another word or two about in a moment, were very much on the side of anti-democracy. Now, some people think, oh yeah, well, America was different after 1776 because we had separation of church and state. That's a bit of a myth, actually. Officially, the Anglican Church, which was still established down to 1776, in 6 of the 13 states was disestablished, so there was an element of church disestablishment, but that didn't separate church and state in America. All the legislatures, all of them, all 13 or 14, retained the 3 big supports for interaction of church and state in America after 1776 were religious tests for office holders in the state governments. Some of them actually had the oath you had to swear if you took office in certain states included you had to swear to your belief in the Old and New Testament. It was deliberately designed in some cases to exclude Jews and deists and agnostics, as well as obviously Muslims or Confucianists, everybody except Christians from holding office. Then secondly, nearly everywhere you still had compulsory, whether you agreed with that church or not, whatever was the dominant church in your locality, everybody had to pay church taxes. These church taxes continued for quite a long time, compulsory church taxation. Everyone had to pay it. In Massachusetts, for instance, down to the 1830s. I think it was around 1833 that they finally got rid of that. But in some states, it went on longer in parts of New England. Then there were strict blasphemy laws denying the right to disparage Christ's Bible or church. And there were a few extras which were not so serious, perhaps, but irritated some people, obligatory Sunday observance. There's a marvelous letter from the Spanish American libertador Francisco de Miranda, who spent quite a lot of time in America during the revolutionary period, and he loved playing his flute, but he wasn't allowed to play it practice it on Sundays, and he was really cross about that. And so Sunday observance was enforced, and until 1801, President Jefferson, the third president, discontinued this. But until 1801, there was still quite a lot of public, governmentally proclaimed presidential Thanksgiving and fast days. If there was some big military victory or some crisis that required a fast day, the president could declare that. So there were also other ways in which church and state intermingled. Now, most of the states, as I've said, had restricted suffrages, and often for the state senate, the suffrage was even more restricted. The right to vote for the Senate was often restricted even more than for the House. And in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Constitution, for instance, was largely written by John Adams, one of the most important founding fathers, the second president of the United States. John Adams hated Tom Paine. He hated democracy. As far as he was concerned, all that was wrong with Britain was that they hadn't extended the principles of the British Constitution to America. There was nothing wrong with the British system. Society should be run by aristocrats, and like Adams. And so he wrote the new Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 actually excluded more white householders from voting for the state assembly than the old charter had before 1776, which is rather amazing. But Adams wanted a proper society. Massachusetts should be a proper society, which means that only people with a lot of land or a lot of money should be voting and involved in politics. It had nothing to do with, it's not just the property list, but the small man doesn't have any place in politics and shouldn't be part of it. And very many people agreed with that in American society at the time. Now, a word about the democratic societies. Now, you can understand that with a system like that, there were a lot of people in America who didn't think that the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that the things they'd fought for in the Revolution, that the revolutionary tendency had been fulfilled to nearly the extent that it ought to have been. So there are very, very many dissatisfied people. And so you will also understand that once in, not only in France, but a major revolution, of course, broke out in France in 1789, but you have to remember that there were a lot of revolutionary and democratic movements, very strong ones, in the Low Countries, especially in the northern Netherlands, in Switzerland, in England, where you begin to get, although most people are against it, nevertheless this democratic opposition worried the British government a lot. There were plenty of it. In London, in Manchester, in Birmingham, there were a lot of people supporting Paine and Priestley, and this is what the government was really worried about. That democracy was on the march, and it was felt to be a great threat, and it was felt to be equally a great threat in the United States. And from 1792, contrary to the impression you might get from some history books, although the upper echelons of the American government, the American government was rather divided over this. I'll say something about that in a moment. But if you look at American society more generally, until you can see a change a bit later from about 1796, but between 1789 and 96, nearly all Americans were very supportive of the French Revolution and agreed with Paine the basic principles of the American Revolution were the same as the basic principles of the French Revolution. So it's not surprising that in 1792, 3, 4, these democratic societies grew up, especially in Philadelphia and New York, where they were very active and had quite a lot of support. But you had them all over the place, even in Kentucky and Tennessee. There were smaller versions of the democratic societies. And Washington and the more conservative elements in the Senate and in Congress generally were very worried about this. There was a lot of the Whiskey Rebellion of 1793, which was a big rising discontent about taxes and other things in Western Pennsylvania, was blamed on these democratic societies. They were called anarchists, murderers, inciting violence, and there was a whole propaganda drive. And Washington personally, the president, condemned the democratic societies in Congress in no uncertain terms. And this is an important aspect of American history, which is not very well known in the early 1790s, the rise of the democratic societies and their important role in support of democracy and the principles, the democratic republican principles of the French Revolution. I emphasize that. The French Revolution, of course, is complicated. I haven't got time to go into that. But there are basically three revolutions within one. There was a conservative monarchist constitutional revolution, which is one thing. And later on, especially from 1793, you have the populist, authoritarian, very intolerant, rather tyrannical, the populist revolution of Marat and Robespierre. That's a different thing. They weren't interested in American values. They certainly weren't interested in freedom of expression. No one was allowed to dissent, no criticism, no free press, none of that stuff, just off with people's heads who disagree with the government. That's a completely different thing, Robespierre, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about their support for the democratic republicans, which is what at that time most Americans would agree was the real French Revolution. And there's an interesting list of the credo of the American democratic societies on the wall there, which goes, where is it? Which I can't find. I've got a list of what the credo is, but they're not very flattering statement of their principles. Here again is the devil saying how pleased he is that the democracy is progressing so well and they're messing up American society in this way. This skinny guy in the middle is he's saying, damn governments, I will not be worth $1 as long as there's any government at all. And there's a black man here who's very pleased that it's soon going to be his turn, and so on. So the idea is that democracy means general anarchy and mayhem, and is going to be a very destructive thing. Now, those Americans who here they are. These were the 7 points of the creed on the wall. So, as you see, not a very flattering account of what these democratic societies were supposed to represent. All means justifiable to good end, the society up and all else down. The first one, the people are all and we are the people, etc. Oh, there he is with his damn governments. I should never be worth $1 as long as there's any government at all. Now, those Americans who sincerely and passionately supported the democratic cause, and none was more passionate supporter of the democratic tendency than the American Revolution's greatest poet, Philip Freneau, and were very proud of the fact that one of the 2 rival sets of American values, so American values are 2 contradictory things in conflict with each other, and the democratic set of values was the set of American values which appealed to those elements that were starting the revolutions and engaged in revolution in Europe. So this idea that from that bright spark which first illumined these lands, see Europe kindling as the blaze expands, each gloomy tyrant sworn to chain the mind, presumes no more to trample on mankind. Even potent Louis, so Louis XVI, of course, had helped the Americans to win their independence against Britain. Even potent Louis trembles on his throne, the generous prince who made our cause his own. So even Louis XVI is in trouble now. And, but he's very pleased that American values have had this igniting effect in Europe. And the fact, he's right, Freneau was absolutely right that only the democratic tendency in the American Revolution exerted any appeal in Europe. Why should the European aristocrats and kings be impressed with John Adams' aristocratism? They had a much more formal, defined aristocracy in Britain, so they didn't need any lessons from America about aristocratic republicanism. And this was a really big problem for American diplomats in the revolutionary and immediate post-revolutionary period in Europe. I've been reading John Adams' letters whilst he was in Holland, and some of the things that the Dutch say about him is really quite funny. Adams, whilst the war with Britain was going on especially, was really in a fix, because he sent there, and you have a tremendous conflict going on in the Netherlands between the Patriotten, the Democrats, who supported the American Revolution, and the Orangists, who were the aristocrats who supported the Prince of Orange and supported Britain. They were all behind Britain in the war against America. So when John Adams was sent to Holland, he's told, well, you have to make an alliance with the Democrats because they're the only ones that support the American Revolution. So he writes these letters back saying, well, I have to pretend to be on the side of the Democrats because they're the only ones who support the American Revolution. But their politics is absolutely horrible. I mean, they have all this terrible democratic stuff. The Orangists, who keep saying how wonderful the British Constitution is, a mixed monarchy, they're the ones who understand politics. So I should be on the other side, but I can't be. And then, horror of horrors, when the war ended and he was sent as the American envoy to England, poor Adams found himself in exactly the same situation. Of course, it's not surprising after 1783 that Americans weren't particularly popular in England, and the English upper classes, in fact, nearly everybody in England used to cold shoulder and not be very polite or pleasant towards Americans. He complains about this quite a lot. In fact, he says in his reports from London, the only people that would talk to him were the Democrats, but these Democrats understand nothing about politics. They don't understand how wonderful the British Constitution is and how correct it is to be ruled by aristocrats. So the only person, one of the few that would invite him to dinner is Richard Price, a great Welsh Democrat who I come to in a moment. And but Price was a Democrat, so he was in the same fix as he'd been in Holland. So he actually wrote this in a letter to Jefferson, who was a Democrat, saying, "This is such a problem for me. You know, I don't know what to talk about. If I am invited to dinner in London, then the only thing I can discuss is theology." And now Franklin became, in the early stages of the French Revolution, which, remember, had quite a big impact in Canada. So Canada, Franklin is the apotheosis of Franklin, who died in 1790, as a symbol of liberty, really was an important part of the rhetoric of democracy and of democratic republicanism in France. In America, though that was very divisive, and a lot of people were not keen on that aspect in America. But also, interestingly, in Canada. At the beginning of the American Revolution, the Americans had briefly occupied Montreal and laid siege to Quebec. And to begin with, there was some support for the American Revolution amongst the French Canadians. This rapidly went away because it was a ragged American army that didn't have much money with them. And when they started just seizing the food they needed rather than paying for it, their popularity rapidly dwindled, as you can imagine. But in fact, there was in the early stages support, and Franklin had been sent at the beginning of 1776 as the head of a congressional commission to Montreal with printers and propaganda and so on to encourage the Canadians to join. And although during the American Revolution itself, the British successfully squashed the revolution in Canada, the general feeling was, both in France and America, I've noticed in newspapers and in correspondence in the 1790s, that sooner or later Canada would break away from Britain and join the United States. And in the early 1790s, there was certainly a strong resurgence of the democratic tendency in Canada, and again with Franklin as something of a symbol, and it was suppressed. In 1791, you have the British Canada Act, which tried to deflect dissatisfaction by Canada was divided into Upper and Lower Canada. In both cases, you had two houses in the legislature, with the upper house appointed appointees, but big landowners and people with a lot of money with very, very restricted suffrage, not really a suffrage at all. They were basically appointees of the crown to create a kind of aristocratic republican framework in Canada as well. So in Canada too, this basic conflict that I've been describing played out from actually from 1775 onwards. Now, the most important, at least certainly on an intellectual and theoretical level, of the democratic republicans in France was Condorcet, who's very, very important, of course, not just as a philosophe, but as a theorist of elections and of constitutions. He chaired the Revolutionary Constitutional Committee, which formulated the first democratic republican constitution in Europe, which is in February 1793. It's also the first modern constitution with the secret ballot. That's very important. The Americans didn't, the secret ballot hadn't made an appearance anywhere until 1793 in Condorcet's constitution. But Condorcet was just like Paine, and this is absolutely correct, I think, absolutely correct. What we're doing is creating democratic republicanism with a free press and freedom of expression, and removing ecclesiastical authority from the system. And this is the same as American values, or what he meant was the American democratic tendency. The Americans have taught us how to conquer liberty. It is from them also that we must learn the secret of how to conserve it. That's absolutely correct. There's a very close parallelism between the democratic republican revolution in France and the democratic republican revolution in America. But as I say, both faced a lot of opposition. And now, here is another print about Paine. In late 1792, when the Republic was set up in France, they sent him a very nice letter saying, we're so impressed with all you've written that we want to make you an honorary member of the French National Convention, and he accepted. This is an English print deriding his letter of acceptance. There it says rights of man, and there equality of property. And he says that I am ready and willing to offer my services to any nation or people under heaven who are desirous of liberty and equality, but the services consist of anarchy, murder, famine, and so on. Now, another great theorist of the democratic revolution was, and another Christian, by the way, but he, again, like Priestley, a Unitarian, who said, you know, Christianity, religion is important for the individual, but professional clergies have no role. They shouldn't be part of the institutional system. They have no role in public life, in politics, in legislation, in law. They should be excluded, or publicly supported education. They should be excluded from all those things. And one of his most important points is the importance of the American Revolution for improving Britain. And of course, this went down extremely badly with most people in England, as you can imagine. And in fact, it was only the Democrats who thought this was a sensible point of view. And that is why you get prints like this, smelling out a rat. So Price is a key example of the fact that it's not just atheists and deists who joined the radical Enlightenment. Price was a classic radical enlightener, being a Democrat and great enemy of all institutionalized clergies and ecclesiastical authority, but he was also a genuine man of religion, so it's extremely unfair to call him an atheist. Here he's being called an atheistical revolutionist, disturbed in his midnight calculations. This is Edmund Burke, the great conservative ideologue, you know, smelling out a rat. That's why it's called smelling out a rat. Burke could see, was extremely rude about Richard Price, who he thought considered to be a traitor, basically. That's the title of Burke's most famous book on the French Revolution, Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is an outright attack. Of course, what Burke stood for was to maintain the British aristocracy and clergy and the bishops in their dominant position in British public life. For Burkeites, a healthy society must be based on crown and religion and aristocracy, and Price is everything opposed to that. And that's why there's a picture on the wall of Price's apartment showing the beheading of King Charles I of England in the revolution in the 1640s. And the caption speaks of, the caption refers to the death of King Charles I or the glory of Great Britain. Now, I need to draw the lecture to a conclusion, but there are just a few more illustrations that I want to show you very quickly. And I also want to just reiterate what I've been saying about Franklin, who I think came to be a very great not a symbol of the democratic tendency, but also somebody who understood in a very sensitive way all its dimensions and often expressed democratic sentiments in a very forceful and I think also even moving way, as you can see here. So when people started saying, well, the French Revolution is going all wrong, all these terrible convulsions, so we find this interesting passage: the convulsions in France are attended with some disagreeable circumstances, but if by the struggle she obtains and secures for the nation its future liberty and a good constitution, a few years' enjoyment of those blessings will amply repair all the damages their acquisition may have occasioned. God grant that not only the love of liberty, but a thorough knowledge of the rights of man may pervade all the nations of the earth, so that a philosopher may set his foot anywhere on its surface and say, this is my country. That's the radical enlightenment. Now, Gouverneur Morris, who Washington got rather the first American ambassador in France during during the French Revolution, Jefferson, being a democratic Republican, got very enthusiastic and sent very enthusiastic reports back to Philadelphia, which was still the capital, of course, and even took part in the revolution. It's quite clear that Jefferson was supporting the democratic tendency in the French Revolution. So Washington rapidly got fed up with this and recalled him. And the next American ambassador was a really solid aristocrat, Gouverneur Morris. That's his country home. And it's interesting, although Morris was entirely on the side of aristocracy and against the Democrats, he had just as clear a sense of how the split in the French Revolution paralleled the split in the American Revolution. And I think that's very significant. So he says here, France is split into parties whose inveteracy of hatred is hardly conceivable. The aristocrats consider America and the Americans as having occasioned their misfortunes, deeming it ingratitude, saying that it was the French king who stepped forward to our relief. Should this party get the better in the struggle, there are very few Americans who would be well received. On the other hand, the Republicans consider everything short of downright democracy as an abandonment of political principle in an American. And that was his basic problem. No one was more opposed to democracy than the American ambassador in Paris. And yet, there was a sense in which, being the American ambassador, he represented the Americanism and the democratic tendency, which was such an important factor in the French Revolution. Well, the result, one of the underlying, this was rather hidden, and American historians didn't, until very recently, American historians didn't like to talk about this very much. It's somehow rather embarrassing that they didn't parade it or show it very much publicly. But by the middle 1790s and even more in the late 90s, but in the last years of Washington's presidency, Jefferson and Washington were really political enemies. And I put this on the screen because Thomas Fleming's book, The Great Divide, the conflict between Washington and Jefferson that defined a nation, is one of the very few books that uninhibitedly is prepared to tell you that, in fact, these two great founding fathers, Washington and Jefferson, in fact, became outright political enemies over democratic republicanism versus aristocratic republicanism. Well, I just want to show you some of the propaganda prints against Jefferson in America. American ideological politics in the 1790s became so ferocious that it makes the sort of thing we see now look almost gentle at times. The insults are unbelievable and still rather shocking. Here is Jefferson who wants to, Jefferson, who is trying to overthrow the American Constitution. He wants to throw the American Constitution on the altar of Gallic despotism, which is being fed by Paine's writings and other subversive texts. But there's divine providence, which intervenes, and that's the Federalist Party and the supporters of the aristocrats, who fortunately prevent Jefferson from doing this. So in this print, it's a rather similar story. Here's the devil again helping Jefferson, and Jefferson finds he's saying that pulling down the federal government was more difficult than he anticipated. And anyway, in this bumpy ride of early American and, as I say, the whole Western or the whole Atlantic world, the democratic tendency in the entire Atlantic world, which, of course, the French Revolution went badly wrong. Then you had Napoleon. Then you had the Restoration. You had Waterloo and the Restoration. The kings come back and aristocracy comes back. And it looked as if reaction had triumphed in 1815. And there was, although there were big revolutionary upheavals again in 1830 and 1848, that's the last time there's a real democratic republican upsurge in Europe. Each time the kings and the aristocracies managed to win. In America, on the other hand, gradually more democratic forms were introduced, though not yet the secret ballot that came in the late 19th century in most of the states. Still not all by any means by the 1830s and 40s, but the real problem, of course, if and I want to end the lecture by, I better just, we'll leave this print out. I was going to say something about democratic religion, and I just wanted to say in relation to the Peterloo Massacre that the British government then passed 6 additional repressive acts, which I think illustrate, or at least 2 of them do, in quite an interesting way, the idea that democracy would be bad because most of the population are ill-informed. And to make sure that most of the population were not properly informed, they greatly increased the taxes on newspapers, the stamp duties on papers, to put them out of reach of the working man so that it would be more difficult for him to read papers. And also, toughened up the anti-blasphemy and seditious laws even more. Immediately after the Peterloo Massacre, this is a print deriding the panic that elements of the British ruling class got into, seeing how strong the democratic tendency was in Britain. The monster, of course, the neck or nothing man, that is democracy at work. The Prince Regent here is losing his wig, and he says, "Oh, my wig's off," and the minister next to him says, "Never mind, so long as your head's on." And so this is still very, very much in the air in 1819. But I wanted to end the lecture by just saying a few words about the situation in America in the middle of the 19th century. So although universal male suffrage had been accepted, there's still battles over this in Rhode Island in the 1840s. I mean, it was far from universal, but it was becoming a dominant tendency in most states. But besides slavery and the institutionalized aristocratism of the legislatures of the system in most of the southern states, you had compromises, changes around 1850. The most notorious, the two most notorious of which were, of course, the War on Mexico, which was quite divisive in America and seemed, which aroused a mood of aggressive chauvinism in some quarters, which some observers found very worrying. But the 1850, the fugitive slave law, which of course made the officials and magistrates in all the northern states complicit in arresting escaped slaves, fugitive slaves, and they were obliged under federal law to arrest and to return fugitive slaves. And this was very hard for many people to stomach. And then, worst of all, because there was the American opinion was very divided over the 1848 revolutions in Europe. And then you had the rise of the Know-Nothing movement in the 1840s and 50s, which was basically a populist, rather prejudiced tendency with a lot of disturbances, the most horrible of which were the Louisville riots in Kentucky when a number of Germans and Irish were killed. These were basically anti-foreigner, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, anti-Italianist, anti-Irish disturbances. And so with all this going on, you can understand that in the years immediately before the Civil War in the United States, there could be a mood of considerable pessimism about the future of democracy. And it seems to me that at that time it was a mood very much shared by the future president, Abraham Lincoln. So I want to end with a quote from a letter which was just around the time of the Louisville riots, when he was really feeling the pessimism. I mean, Emerson, for instance, a famous American of that period, lots of American observers expressed pessimistic feelings about the future of democracy because of all these trends and tendencies. But in Britain, when the revolutions failed in 1848, you have this print showing the British Constitution is the only system that floats. The rest, everything else sinks, and in particular, Republican liberty is a total wreck. So forget it. And this is what I wanted to end with. Abraham Lincoln, writing in August 1855, with the Know-Nothings gaining ground in America. So populism, anti-intellectualism, prejudice, that seemed to be the up-and-coming trend. Progress in degeneracy, concluded Abraham Lincoln, appears to me to be pretty rapid. In 1776, the United States had begun by declaring that all men are created equal, yet the United States Constitution of 1787 accommodated black slavery, and nothing was subsequently done to correct that wrong. When the Know-Nothings get control, America's national creed ought to read, all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it came to that, he added, I shall prefer immigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty, to Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.